This is the Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi called Columbus on the Tom Bigby River. And sometimes I write about the rest of the state. Today's episode is titled Alexander Buford Meek, Poet, Orator, and Statesman. Alexander Meek was born July 1814 in Columbia, South Carolina, to Samuel Mills Meek and Anna Arabelle Meek. The family moved to Tuscaloosa, Alabama area when Meek was about 5 years old. Meek would eventually enroll at the University of Georgia, which was about the only university of any size at that time in the Deep South, followed by he would transfer or move a year later to the University of Alabama, a newly formed school. He graduated from the University of Alabama in 1833 and then read law in Tuscaloosa for 2 years before being admitted to the Alabama bar in 1835. The same year, he became the editor of Tuscaloosa's Democratic newspaper, the Flag of the Union. In 1836, Meek volunteered in the U.S. Army in the Seminole Wars in Florida. After his return home, he was appointed at age 23 as the Attorney General of Alabama by Governor Clement Comer Clay. In 1842, he was appointed a probate judge in Tuscaloosa, but when it was time for him to actually be elected to the position, when it was the re-election time, he lost. Meek supported James K. Polk for president and was designated Alabama's electoral voter in Washington for that election. As a reward, when Polk won the presidency, Meek got an appointment in the federal treasury, where he served for 1 year, followed by an appointment as the federal attorney for the Southern District of Alabama, which moved him closer to home, to Mobile, where he would remain until 1863. His appointment as federal attorney expired in 1848, and so he took on the position as editor of the Mobile Register until 1853. In 1852 to 1853, he also campaigned for a seat in the Alabama legislature, which he won. And as a legislature, Meeks crafted the law to establish a public school system for Alabama. He was appalled by the lack of literacy in the state. He also was a frequent orator at the time at dignitary receptions for people who came, for ambassadors and important people who came from Europe. And of course, he also spoke at banquets, and he was growing in notoriety as a speaker. In 1854, he was appointed probate judge to finish someone else's term in Mobile County. But again, Meeks lost his secession election. He left politics for the next 4 years after the election of Whig President Zachary Taylor, and focused on his writing and his new Mobile-born wife, Emma Donaldson Slater. In 1855, he published his book-length narrative poem, The Red Eagle, a poem of the South, set in the Creek War, which was from 1813 to 1814, with Creek Chief William Weatherford, aka Red Eagle, as the hero. This is one of the earliest works of American literature with a Native American protagonist. It is considered one of the best pre-Civil War long narrative poems ever written in the South. In 1856, while acting as a James Buchanan presidential elector for the state of Alabama, Meek published 2 books, Romantic Passages in Southwestern History and Songs and Poems of the South. By 1859, Meek was reelected to the Alabama legislature and chosen Speaker of the House. In December of 1854, Tennyson published his narrative poem, Charge of the Light Brigade, in the British Examiner. At that time, Tennyson was Poet Laureate of the United Kingdom. Alexander Meek and a publisher friend of the New Orleans Sunday Delta were bantering back and forth about the lack of appreciation that existed in England and the US for Native American themed literature. This seems to be a common theme in Meek's discussions at that time. Meeks and his friend came to the conclusion that Alexander should write a narrative poem about the Crimean battle at Balaclava, which is where the Charge of the Light Brigade is celebrating or lamenting. And his publisher friend of the Sunday Delta would publish it under the name of a famous Scottish poet, Alexander Smith, to test if the thing would be popular or not. This led to years of confusion over the authorship of the piece Balaclava. However, it was quite popular for years. It has even been claimed that Queen Victoria so loved the piece she printed it for distribution to the public. However, I've not found anything that even remotely substantiates that claim or that Tennyson was jealous of its attention. Possibly that happened. However, I've not found any newspaper articles or any pieces published that state thus. Meeks, by 1859, was completely focused on his job as Speaker of the Alabama House. The session ran from November 1859 to February of 1860. During this session, the legislature passed a resolution for a secession convention if Abraham Lincoln won the upcoming presidential election. 100 delegates were chosen. One of them was Alexander Meek. He was vehemently opposed to secession from the Union. He was a pro-Unionist and felt that the South had a stronger voice and a stronger position if it stayed part of the Union. He did leave politics at the end of his term. As we know, the Civil War was ready to begin. As the war began, Meeks remained home caring for his wife, who soon after dies. He mourns her loss in the summer of 1863 by writing and publishing poetry. 2 pieces, war poems, is published in the Mobile Register. In January of 1864, Alexander Meek travels to Columbus, Mississippi to visit his older brother Samuel and Samuel's wife, the daughter of the late Colonel William Cannon, at the Cannon family home that we know of as Wisteria Place in Columbus. While there, he met William Cannon's widow, Eliza Jane Cannon. Alexander Meek married Eliza in September of 1864. He would die less than a year later, he would die a little over a year later in November 1st of 1865 at age 51. He is buried in the same plot as Elizabeth's first husband, William Cannon, in the same family square, and it is presumed that Eliza is buried in between them. Mr. Cannon and Mr. Meek both have very tall memorials. However, there's a blank space in between, but it's devoid of a headstone. It is presumed that is where Eliza lies. Several points of interest follow when exploring locally published myths and legends about Meek. In 1904, his niece Julia Adair Meek, Samuel's daughter, is in the Columbus Weekly newspaper as getting married, and the piece describes the deceased as, quote, Judge Alexander B. Meek, the poet recalled as the sweet bard of the Confederacy, which is really funny considering in reality he was a pro-Union anti-secessionist, and he didn't publish anything that we know of during the actual Civil War. In 1921, the Columbus Dispatch lists Meeks as a, quote, Confederate poet, and citing a poem from his collection, Songs and Poems of the South, which was written in the late 1840s and early 1850s as example of him being a Confederate poet. In a 1939 Montgomery Advisor, it states, the renowned Southern orator Meeks was conspicuously missing from ceremonies to swear Jeff Davis in as president of the Confederacy in February of 1861, and the author adds that Meeks was known to be a man of, quote, strong Unionist tendencies. Clearly, he was not in favor of the Confederacy. A funny anecdote about Eliza Cannon Meek, his wife, who asked her son-in-law Samuel and her husband Alexander what the Meeks family had added to the Cannon family. The reply from Samuel, Alex's older brother, brains, madam, brains. A contemporary of Meeks, Reverend Philip Neely, perhaps described him best. He was beyond comparison the handsomest man of his time, 6 feet 4 inches high, with a symmetrical face. And when we add to them his grace and uniform courtesy, we shall have before us one of the most remarkable men who ever lived in Mobile. Take him all in all, he was the most lovable man I ever knew. Thank you for coming along on my podcast, The Tom Bigby Tales. Until next time.